Welcome, everyone. We are here at the Creeks Restoration and Water Quality Improvement Citizen Advisory Committee meeting on Wednesday, January 18th. And I'd like to officially call this meeting to order. And Stephanie, would you please do roll call?
Committee member Stephanie Moray.
Here.
Committee member Todd Rulon Miller.
Here.
Committee member Lee Heller.
Here.
Committee member Lori Gaskin.
Present.
Committee member Chris Klein. Absent. Committee member Ann Burdett.
Present.
And Chair Penny Owens.
Present.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Our next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the May 21st, 2025 meeting.
I'll move approval.
And I'll second.
You just need an all in favor, right? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, excellent. That carries. And now we are moving to checking in with Erin on any agenda adjustments for today.
Thank you, Chair Owens. We have no adjustments today.
Beautiful. Moving right along. We are now on to public comment, and this is public comment for any items that are not being addressed already on today's agenda. So on today's agenda, we have our first business item will be the creek buffer ordinance. So if you'd like to leave a comment for that, if you're present, you can fill out a form and hand it up here to Stephanie. Or the Parkway Retrofit Program would be item 7B. And then I believe for members joining us online, if they would like to provide any comments, they can raise their hand in some Zoom fashion. And Stephanie will call on you. Do we have anyone joining us online today?
There's one attendee, but they're a liaison for the Parks and Rec staff.
Well, greetings to our liaison. All right, are there any public comments for items not on the agenda? All right, moving forward, we move to item number 6, committee member and staff communications. Back to Creeks Division Manager, Erin.
I do have one staff update that we have filled our project planner positions. So we have a new staff member that started with us this week, Evan Hobson, and I'm sure he'll join us at a future meeting to meet you all. So we are officially fully staffed after some retirements almost a year, actually a year and a half ago.
Great news. We'll look forward to meeting with him at a future meeting. And that moves us along here to our business items. So first we have a draft creek buffer ordinance update and discussion being presented to us by Erin Markey, Creeks Division Manager, and Melissa Hetrick, Adaptation and Resilience Division Manager. I'll hand it over to you two. Thanks so much.
All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Melissa Hetrick, Adaptation and Resilience Manager in the Sustainability and Resilience Department. And you all know Erin Markey, the Creeks Division Manager. And we just wanted to give an update on the draft creek buffer ordinance that we released earlier this year and the comments we received and next steps. So just a reminder what a creek buffer is. It's just a natural area between a new structure and a creek. Next slide. So the reason that we have creek buffers are many, but these are just some of them. One of them is to prevent new structures from being threatened by erosion and flooding. Also to limit bank hardening, which can degrade creek habitats, but also lead to erosion and flooding downstream. Provide an area for runoff to be slowed before entering the creeks, thereby reducing flooding downstream and filtering pollutants. And then protecting federal, state, and city protected sensitive creek habitats. So most riparian or creekside habitats are federally, state, and city protected. And then to mitigate cumulative impacts from development along creeks within the city. Next slide. So we've had quite a few questions about why we actually need an ordinance as opposed to some other mechanism for creek buffers. And right now we're only codified buffers. So that means, when I say codified, I mean that they're in the municipal code. is a 25-foot setback from Mission Creek from the 1960s. For all other city creeks lacked defined buffers in our municipal code that apply to all development. And so what happens right now is that when projects trigger what's called CEQA, or California Environmental Quality Act review, that's a state law, the buffers are being determined, the protective buffers are being determined on a case-by-case basis with technical reports. So that process is very costly and slow and has resulted in inconsistent outcomes over time. But also, CEQA only applies when what's called a discretionary permit is required, or a discretionary action. And that's really a permit like a coastal development permit or a conditional use permit, where a body or a person actually uses their judgment to determine consistency. A ministerial permit is based on very objective standards, and if that are measurable, and if you meet those, then you get your permit. There isn't, quote, discretion in it. So an example of a ministerial permit is a building permit. So if you meet the building code, you can get your permit. There's not a board who decides consistency. And so most other cities have creek buffer regulations in their municipal code so that they apply across the board to all new development. But we don't have that except for Mission Creek. So what has happened over time is projects that require only ministerial permits, such as building permits, don't have creek buffers. And so this has particularly gotten worse over time because the state has mandated a bunch of high priority projects, so like housing and accessory dwelling units, which are great for housing and really good for housing in our state, but the way that they streamline the permitting on them is basically said that only objective standards apply. And so for the majority of cities that already have creek buffer ordinances, that's not a problem because they have objective standards in their municipal codes, but the city does not have that. So what we're seeing is increasingly habitable structures, so not just like patios, but actual structures being built very close to the creek. And in some cases, we've seen them like right on the creek bank, so like literally overhanging the creek. So in 2011, as part of our general plan update, we had to do an environmental impact report for the state, and that environmental impact-based report looked at cumulative development over time as the city was built out. And it found that there was significant cumulative impacts associated with development being too close to our creeks. And part of the reason for that is because we didn't have clear standards. And so as part of that EIR, there was a required mitigation measure that the city committed to in order to mitigate the impacts to less than significant of developing an ordinance with the creek buffer regulations in it. And it basically specifies that we should look into the distance and study like the protective distance, but it should in no case be less than, or it should be more than 25 feet, because that was all we had was the Mission Creek 25-foot setback. So following that time period, when we updated the coastal land use plan in 2019, we started developing creek standards through that process, even though it's a discretionary process. And we developed basically what was code-like language for the coastal zone and put it into our coastal land use plan. And when that was approved by council and our coastal commission, the California Coastal Commission, the recommendation was made that those buffers actually get codified, so put into the municipal code so that they applied to all development and also be brought out citywide. So subsequently in 2023, we approved a new housing element that calls for clearer ordinances, resource protection ordinances, including things such as creek buffers. And it specifically calls out that we should have creek buffer regulations similar to those in the coastal land use plan. So fast forward many years later, we had a delay with COVID rolling everything out, but we developed a draft buffer ordinance as was directed to us. And next slide. And of course, we released that in January. So I don't want to repeat all the information that you guys have already heard about the draft ordinance, but just as a reminder for those who might not have heard about it, it proposed the same setback distances as generally required in the coastal land use plan. So it's 50 feet from the top of bank for major creeks, 35 feet from the top of bank of flood control project reaches. So that's things like the lower emission flood control project. And then for anything else that met the state definition of a creek that needs to be protected, but was not a major creek, didn't have a lot of flow, we proposed 15 feet from top of bank. So next slide. So just again, quick summary, that what was in the draft ordinance is that the buffers applied to new development and substantial redevelopment. Existing legal development can be maintained and repaired and undergo minor alterations, including things like interior remodels. The ordinance provided a process to get a modification to reduce buffer distances on constrained lots. It permitted full post-disaster rebuilding, but required that if the structures could be located outside the buffer, if that was feasible, that should be done. It provided a process for state-mandated ADUs and multi-unit projects to be within buffers if needed, if there wasn't additional land on the property. And then it allowed for fire protection activities such as vegetation maintenance and home hardening. Next slide. So again, we issued the draft ordinance for a public comment period in January, and that comment period ended in April. We sent mailers to all affected property owners and residents. We had a community open house on February 5th. We had presentations to your committee on February 19th and February 6th with Sustainability Council Committee. And then we held 2 online Q&A forums, question and answer forums. And just generally, we've engaged with over 100 stakeholders, either through like on-the-ground meetings or phone calls, and most of them, I would say, landowners. Next slide. So just generally, we received over 100 public comment letters during the public comment period, and those are available online on our website, santabarbaraca.gov/creek buffers. And 64 were clearly opposed to the ordinance, 18 supported the ordinance, and then 39 requested changes or clarification, but did not clearly say whether they were for or against, but clearly they had concerns. In addition, there are now 2 petitions out there. One is from Santa Barbara Creek neighbors against the ordinance, and it has, I believe the latest is 378 signatures. And then a coalition of 15 environmental organizations put out a petition for generally strong creek buffers in Santa Barbara, and that to date has somewhere over 676 signatures about. So I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Markey to go into kind of what are the key major concerns we heard and some options that we're thinking about evaluating further for not cost, but for benefits and impacts to the creek and to the city.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so going to run through some of the comments and some of our potential options moving forward. So opponents of the ordinance shared concerns that the ordinance could lower property values, it could limit development and redevelopment potential. Was unclear how the process or the potential to build ADUs could limit disaster rebuilds and potentially impact property owners' ability to obtain or maintain a mortgage or insurance. So, some of the things we're considering, clarifying that the full housing density allowed on a parcel and any state mandated ADUs would still be allowed, even into the buffers if needed. As long as they were as far away as possible and could meet, basic safety findings. Could allow for rebuilds in place of fire. So, allow for that rebuild when that occurs. These are all just things we're potentially considering based on the feedback that we've heard in the comments. Clarifying that vegetation maintenance and fire hardening measures are allowed without any extra permits. Then raise the thresholds for what triggers that substantial redevelopment definition, and investigate removing some development limitations associated with modification. And then we had a lot of comments and questions regarding what met the definition of a creek and the inaccuracy of the existing creek map layer the city has. Additionally, comments about buffer distances on specific creeks, the idea that every creek and site is different and, kind of like this one size fits all won't work. Concerns about variability in identifying where the top of bank is and that methodology as outlined in the ordinance. And in some cases, basically where the top of bank is identified being too far away from the creek. So some of the potential things we're looking at is actually updating that creek layer, the map layer, with a consultant, some support there. The layer we currently have at the city it's developed in the 90s, and so it is somewhat outdated. We have been manually making some edits as community members have been making us aware of issues, but there is a lot of work still to do there. And this would really, be valuable to do, provide certainty both to staff, but also to community members and residents on what actual creeks would be impacted by a potential ordinance. We've talked about on minor creeks, based on some of the feedback we've received, maybe having a buffer distance be measured from the center line of a creek, because that is more easily identified than the top of bank in some of those situations. And really on those smaller drainages, our concern primarily is with encroachment or development directly into some of those drainage channels and the issues that can cause. We also have considered reassessing, the creek classifications themselves. We had previously done an internal analysis to determine what would be a major versus a minor creek and kind of set a threshold based on watershed acreage. And so some of those creeks, like Toyon Creek, that was very close to the threshold between major and minor creek, could maybe be reassessed. So additionally, some like GIS and watershed analysis could be done to further look at that. And then study just the buffer distances and adjustments that may need to be made based on erosion or habitat, riparian widths, parcel configuration, and a number of different things. So next, we're going to talk about some of the comments we received about allowed uses and exceptions. So we got a lot of comments about what was allowed within buffers under the existing draft and that it's too restrictive. Requests for things like gardening and landscaping and minor improvements to be allowed within buffers. Comments requesting special considerations for historic or other, historic structures essentially, and allowing them to be maintained and repaired possibly without any trigger of substantial redevelopment essentially was an ask, and other community serving buildings that might be impacted. And generally we also received feedback on that essentially trigger for when buffers take effect, so that definition of substantial redevelopment. And then even comments that any existing development, whether it's permitted or not, should be allowed to be repaired or replaced. And so some of the options we're looking at moving forward would be allowing some minimum or minor development within the buffer. Not going to say exactly what that could be, but maybe things like removable patios or decks that can be removed if they get threatened by future erosion. Maybe some minor structures, but those are all things to kind of be evaluated as we move forward. And look at clarity of thresholds for when applying the rules, so adjustment to those triggers of when substantial redevelopment gets triggered, and could consider having essentially a grace period to allow existing unpermitted features or structures to get permitted once the ordinance took effect. And then we had a lot of comments about the proposed modification process, essentially that it would be costly and slow, and that the outcomes weren't necessarily certain, that it wasn't clear that you would, the way it was written, that you would be able to get a modification necessarily. And we had questions about existing entitlements, and so what happens to projects that are kind of midway through the permitting process. And so some of the options here are we could look at making modifications, making the modification process more objective and basically like clearly state you will be eligible for modification if you do X, Y, and Z. Try to simplify the ordinance and kind of reorganize it to make it more based on project type rather than process, which is the way it's written right now. And clarify that existing entitlements would stand, and clearly state at the time of adoption of a future ordinance like how it would be implemented for projects that are midway through the process. And then we had a lot of kind of comments, I think as Melissa already alluded to, regarding why are we doing this? What's the need for the ordinance? A lot of questions about, we already have floodplain regulations, so why do we need additional safety measures? And so, the ordinance would not change existing floodplain regulations, but would address some existing concerns regarding erosion and, undercutting of existing structures or future potential developed structures. A consultant could better analyze those safety hazards and I think compile them into a report, update the 20, 25-year-old studies that we have and kind of compile them in one place to better make clear that justification, as well as the need for the city to address the cumulative environmental impacts from development along creeks. And then there were a number of comments regarding flood control maintenance and flood control projects. A lot of requests, honestly, to see the city and the county doing more. Some concerns about enforcement on illegal structures or illegal alterations to creeks, or things where a neighbor might have constructed something that was kind of damaging a downstream neighbor or directly across neighbors' property, or changing flow patterns. And then a number of comments that were just generally supportive of creek buffers. So in order to fully address some of the concerns and comments that we've seen raised by the community, while also kind of balancing, the desires of property owners and the need for resource protection, we see a real need for some additional technical analysis in order to revise the ordinance and move forward. Some relevant data does exist from past reports and additional internal staff work, but it should be kind of consolidated into a single report and as well updated for some of the older data that we have. A third-party consultant can, really provide a more independent review of proposed buffer distance, the mapping, any related questions and requirements. And so, just to kind of provide a third-party outside opinion on some of those things, as we definitely did have some comments that expressed kind of distrust in staff in the process to date. So the proposed consultant contract would document the need for buffers and the existing regulations and policies that exist and apply. It would compile existing reports and data on the city creeks, including, hydrology, geomorphology, erosion rates, biological conditions. It could assess existing riparian habitat, determine what distances are needed to actually meaningfully protect those existing riparian resources, update that creek layer like we talked about, potentially even look at mapping buffers. We have our doubts that this is truly feasible, but it would provide a lot of clarity to everyone involved if we were able to have mapped buffer distance. So something we would like to explore. Assess the existing parcel sizes and configurations and see really, how many parcels are impacted more clearly in structures adjacent to creeks. And update those erosion studies and safety hazards as needed. And then also do a comparison of existing regulations in other jurisdictions and how what we would end up proposing could align with that, as well as assess, legal compliance with some of the other state housing laws that have come online more recently and ensure whatever is moved forward complies with those. And then just simply try to simplify and revise the ordinance for clarity of all the public and the staff involved. So our proposed next steps, we're here today for you guys to, give an update to the Creeks Advisory Committee, but also get your input on what we're proposing as our next steps moving forward. We will be giving a similar presentation to the Sustainability Council Committee in August. And then we will be looking to put out a request for proposals from consultants, sometime this fall. And then once we have selected a consultant on that effort, we would go back to City Council for a status update for them, but also to award that consultant contract. And these are just estimates, but we're, estimating maybe this fall. That consultant would, start that effort before the end of the year, hopefully, and then maybe we could release a new draft of the ordinance by next summer. So that concludes our presentation, and we're here for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa and Aaron. So first we'll have questions from the advisory committee, and then we'll go to public comment, and then we'll have a chance as a committee to have any discussion following that. So I put it out to our fellow Creek Advisory Committee members. Are there any questions at this time?
I had a couple.
Stephanie,
I have to
can you
find
remember
them. Let's see the.
Is your mic on?
Oh, yeah, there we go, The first question I had was, how are you defining a minor creek?
So in the existing ordinance, it's anything that meets that state definition of a creek. We came up with our own definition of a creek, but it's very aligned with the state definition. So, yeah. But I think to answer that question, that is a question we got a lot from both property owners and community members. So one of the goals of this updated, consultant review is to provide a creek layer that would just clearly show exactly what is impacted by the ordinance, if that makes sense. So it would clearly map out any creek that was subject to the ordinance.
Oh, okay. Let's see, and it kind of relates to the second question. And I took you on a walk to show you an area that to me is a storm drainage. It has pipes, and then it goes, they kind of go halfway through someone's yard, and then they have tens of feet or before going underground again and under another street and so on and so on. But I would call that a drainage, and I have a little sort of memory that a lot of speakers have said, well, this is, it's showing up as a creek, but it's a storm drainage. So when the consultants are going to do the update of the creek layer and buffer mapping, my question is, are they going to include the storm drainage as the current map has it? Like, how are you going to thread that needle? Because I think a lot of people have expressed concern with that.
Yeah, so Chair Owens, Commissioner Murray, this is a big topic, but so anything that meets the state definition of a creek So it has a bed and a bank and intermittent flow, essentially. We can't block or alter or what have you without additional permit processes or regulating that in some way, or we'd be violating state law. So there are different ways that we can accomplish that. So one is through buffers, right? And then another is we have another municipal code section that basically deals with water courses. So it includes like your storm drains and minor creeks, all creeks essentially, that is not super well written right now. Like it's not super clear that you can't just block them without consequences. And so one option we've thought about is for these minor drainages that may or may not qualify as creek that we really just don't want flow blocked or redirected or like them altered, that we could just modify that code section and make it more clear as to the intent of that code section that's not very clear right now. And then really just look at buffers for more of the bigger creeks with the bigger flows. So that's one option that we'd be evaluating. So I think it's kind of inventorying everything we have and their level of flow and the level of regulation needed. Again, our biggest interest with these smaller drainages is not redirecting flow. And it is actually one of the larger comments that we got through a lot of the homeowners had previous issues with this, that it not being clear that you can't just put a shed in the middle of a drainage, because I mean, a lot of people don't realize it is a drainage sometimes, and they'll just put a structure and not realize, and then winter comes, and all of a sudden there's flow ricocheting off the structure onto a neighbor's property. So that's really our goal in those cases, and if that's our goal, maybe there's an easier fix than putting those into this ordinance. So that's, again, kind of the options we'd be looking at, but either way, getting a closer handle on different classifications of different levels of creeks. Does that make sense?
Thank you. And I do want to point out that, you know, I think having a creek buffer ordinance is critically important, and I would say that we're probably decades behind other cities in this. I think you guys have done a wonderful job, and I really appreciate that you had these meetings and took this input and compiled it and are giving it due consideration, so that we can be responsive. And I'm excited to see what the consultants come up with. Thank you.
Chair Owens and Committee Member Murray, I would just add on one thing to that, which is like, you know, we're going to analyze all these options. And so like what that map exactly looks like and exactly which small tributaries are included or not is hard to say. And so we may go the route Melissa's describing, where we make some amendments in Title Chapter 14. There may still be major and minor creeks. Like we may just eliminate what is shown on that, a lot of what is shown on that map now. When we release that map, we always kind of set it with the caveat that like, this may not accurately depict what's affected by the buffer. So we would like to have something that accurately depicts what this ordinance would apply to down the line.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think Committee Member Gaskin has some questions.
Thank you so much. Not so much a question, just a comment following up on that last discussion by my colleague. As someone who birds most of the riparian areas in the city of Santa Barbara, I am astounded and appalled at the level of impact on minor drainages and in channels, what are considered flood control channels, either because a property owner doesn't know, unaware, or in a clandestine way. And I would hope we don't, through this process, weaken it so much that we are negatively impacting flow where it's designed to do its natural work, which is infiltration and addressing the drainage in its natural state. So that was my only comment about the minor as well as the flood control channels or the drainages.
Thank you. Committee member Todd.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the congratulations on listening. I think your list of concerns raised, though we haven't answered all those, is exceptional, and the kind of process you're going through is commendable. So number one, I wanted to echo that. I just had one question on the consultant, and it's early on the question. Is there any estimate as to what that might be or cost, and how would it be budgeted or paid for?
Chair Owens and Committee Member Todd Ruland-Miller, that's a great question. I do just want to specify that I think right now we should only be taking questions, and then we should go to public comment before we have more of a discussion. Sorry, I kind of missed that rules of order here, but I can gladly answer that question. We estimate, and it's hard to say with certainty because we don't have the full scope outlined yet of exactly what we would be including, but we estimate around $400,000, and that would be coming from the Creeks Reserve Fund.
Thank you. And question, committee member Ann Burdick?
My question is with the definition of a creek, which I'm reading from the January draft, which may be slightly different, but a naturally occurring water course that conveys water seasonally or year-round. What is the definition of naturally occurring? Like, how is that defined? Because that could be a spectrum of things. Does that mean naturally occurring before anything was built there, or naturally occurring just because someone is watering their yard?
Chair Owens and Committee Member Budette. So this is also a question we've had from the public, and so our assumption was that naturally occurring pre-development condition could be verified on aerial photos or something along those measures. But again, we hope to kind of remove this uncertainty and have that all mapped out and clearly identified moving forward.
Any questions at this time? All right, now we'll go to public comment. We're going to do the, barring no questions from the committee at this time, we're going to do the in-person speakers first, and then we'll see if any folks online would like to share any comments with us. So first up, we have Nate Irwin.
So 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Awesome. Well, good to see everyone. Good evening, Chair and committee members. My name is Nate Irwin, and I'm here representing Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. First, I want to thank Aaron and Melissa for their thoughtful and persistent work on this ordinance. It's really encouraging to see this long overdue ordinance moving forward, finally. Just want to note that during the public comment period for the Draft Creek Buffer Ordinance, Channel Keeper joined 18 other local organizations in submitting a letter in conditional support of the draft ordinance. Since then, a petition, as was noted, supporting strong creek buffers has gathered to date, as I looked on my phone, 692 signatures and the endorsement of 19 community organizations. So the community is definitely paying attention, and the support for meaningful action is real and it's growing. Santa Barbara has long been recognized as an environmental leader, but as we've seen with our creek buffer protections, we've definitely fallen behind. And while other jurisdictions have adopted riparian setbacks, we've lacked consistent standards, which has left our creeks and our community vulnerable. This ordinance is an invaluable opportunity to change that. The science is definitely clear. When creeks have space, they thrive, and so do our communities. Healthy riparian buffers slow and filter stormwater, they reduce erosion, they protect against flooding, they support wildlife, and they support native species. And according to the EPA, riparian buffers are among the most effective tools for improving water quality, enhancing habitat, and building community resilience. This is an opportunity for Santa Barbara not just to catch up, but to lead once again. Strong creek buffers offer a path forward, one rooted in science, community values, and long-term sustainability. They offer protection, restoration, and hope. Let's embrace that promise for our creeks, for our neighborhoods, and the generations of people and wildlife who will look back and thank us for protecting these vital watersheds when it mattered most. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nate. Next up, we have Chris Dahlstrom.
Excuse me. Good afternoon. Chris Dahlstrom, resident at 424 North Ontario Road. We own property directly adjacent to and within the creek. Our property lines extend into the center line or beyond the center line of the creek. We consider ourselves stewards of that creek, of our portion of the creek, and so do our neighbors. So it took us by surprise seeing the beginnings of this ordinance and how definitions were vague and sometimes inconsistent, including what was defined as blue line creeks and other types of drainages. In fact, just to talk a little bit about Stephanie's question about drainages, the city of Santa Barbara at the top of Ontario Road at Foothill installed a drop inlet that was not there before, that drains now into our neighbor's property. So that was a contribution, and it's not us as property owners that are creating water quality issues, habitat problems. We try to protect it. There are a lot of other reasons that are occurring that are hydrologic, that are geomorphological, and riparian biological that has occurred in the creek channels that are not the property owners. For instance, San Roque Creek, there was the debris basin that was put in by the county. There are several check dams that were put in by the county. Those need to be looked at. There's starvation of sediments, there's scour going on. It's not from the property owners, it's from processes and projects done by public agencies. I worked for a public agency for 35 years, water supply and geomorphology, hydrology, and hydrogeology. And this should have started with an analysis, not done in the year 2000. It should have started with a study, and that's what kicked it off. But that's not what happened. So you're going to find, as this progresses, that the property owners that are impacted are going to be called for concern on this one. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. Stephanie, will you queue up our online comments, please?
I'm currently seeing no online speakers.
Sorry, I mistook. I thought you said there were 2. All right, then that comes back to the committee if there are further discussions or comments at this time. Committee Member Hill.
Chair Owens, thank you. Just following up on the last public speaker, I think what's being proposed is a response to the concerns you've raised, which is to bring in a consultant to do the kind of careful analysis, definition, and survey that you felt was absent in what was initially proposed. So I certainly support the proposal in that it should provide the community with the inventory we need and the definitions that we need to make well-informed decisions.
Committee Member Gaskin.
May I make a comment just in general about staff? Is that possible? Thank you. I'm saddened to hear something, I think, Aaron, that you said about there's distrust of our staff. And I feel compelled to comment about that because it saddens me greatly. Other than Penny, I am the longest sitting committee member on this advisory committee, and I have seen nothing but stellar, professional, competent, visionary, just proactive staff come before us repeatedly with these projects and vision and strategic thinking that does nothing but honor and protect what this program is all about. And I am, on behalf of our fellow citizens, I am so saddened that you have felt distrust. I sensed that, picked it up, but as you guys have done before, you rose to the challenge. And I cannot express enough how thoughtful the response has been in the documentation and in your plan of action. So I am so sorry because I have the utmost respect for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I echo those sentiments and just really want to thank all the staff that's present here and all the other members of your team that worked so hard on these thoughtful, compiling all this information, this many, many public meetings, the future work that's coming ahead, and really look forward to seeing what we learn and some of that additional data and information and clear definitions that we'll get from working with the consultant. So thank you.
Chair Owens, I just have one more comment to add, which, we received over 121 comments or something like that, and, they ran the gamut of different things, so they're all across the board. And so there were a number of very thoughtful comments, whether they were for or against, but people really put in time to review the ordinance, call out specific concerns, make even recommendations on actual changes. So I would also just like to echo, thank you for the community engagement. Thank you for the comments that we've received. It's super valuable as part of the process as we hopefully move towards a better updated ordinance.
Excellent. Committee member Burdett.
Well, thank you, the staff, for putting this together. I agree with those sentiments that were just expressed, and I definitely support having a creek buffer ordinance in Santa Barbara. I think it is long overdue. I do think that this proposal is a good idea to go back and finalize or figure out some of the details that community members have been bringing concerns about. I wanted to reiterate that going back over that map and making sure that the creeks are defined in a clear way that is accurate and applies the standards in ways that are realistic, I think is a good idea, because if the standards are applied in a way where the same standard applies to something that the majority of the community considers not to be a creek as to something that the majority of the community considers to be a creek, I think there's just too much potential for exceptions to be made that set a precedent that undermines the rules. And I think that obviously some exceptions will have to be made, but I think that going back over that map and ensuring that the creeks are correctly mapped, including the minor creeks, and that nothing on there is kind of unrealistic for community members to follow, will actually strengthen the ordinance, because it will just make the rules more clear, easy for people to actually follow instead of asking for exceptions for things. And that way there will be a hard line on what you can and cannot do, and that will protect the creeks in the future.
Thanks. One more comment from committee member Murray.
I'm not on, there we go. I brought this up before, but I think that we need to also coordinate with the building rules that Mr. Ahlstrom brought up a good point, that we have a lot of impervious surface area and people are developing more, and that's impacting our creeks and impacting neighbors. And I think in other communities, there are rules when people are building new buildings about having permeable pavement and putting in, there are places that will scrape off the soil gently, make sure there's no clay left, and put it aside and the plants, and then they will put it back. And there are certainly countries like Germany that, you're only charged a stormwater fee if you have water leaving your property. There are homes that have roofs that go to cisterns, so they drain naturally underground. But I think that it's bigger than just this ordinance. I think, stormwater is important and affects these creeks and takes a lot of pollutants off roads and homes, and they enter our creek. And this is something that we need to consider. And then I wanted to just also address something in a slide, a comment that people had of why do we need a buffer ordinance at all. But I used to teach both rivers and conservation planning at UCSB, and I will say that many species, not just fish, start their lives, and part of their lives are spent in buffers, as anyone who is a bird watcher can attest. And a lot of our pollinators are from that area as well. So if you love to garden, then you'll love your creek buffers. And if you love birds, you'll love your creek buffers as well.
Thank you for that. If there's no further comments from the committee, we'll adjourn that issue, our business item. And thank you again, Melissa and Aaron, for all your work on this. And thanks to the community that came out to speak tonight and joined to watch online. Please stay engaged and provide your feedback as we move forward with this. And happy birthday, Nate. It's his birthday, and he came to a public meeting to give comment. So, but speaking of impervious surfaces, I believe that brings us very nicely to our next item for business this evening. We're going to learn a little bit about City Creek's program's Parkway Retrofit Program. We're going to get an update here from Tim Burgess, a project planner with the Creeks Division.
You can if you want. Okay, thanks. Good evening. Nice to see everybody. I appreciate your time. I am Tim Burgess, and I'm here to talk about the Parkway Retrofit Program. So, as you all know, and you've just been discussing, urban stormwater runoff is a problem for water quality and habitat in streams downstream. As we increase impervious surfaces in the city, that affects the hydrograph, that affects water flowing downstream. It not only does it picks up pollutants off of impervious surfaces, carries them directly into the creeks without treatment, but it also, by modifying the hydrograph, running off really quickly. You can see in the bottom right here, there's the, that slide in the bottom right where it shows the two different hydrographs of, say, a storm. So the dashed line is like a natural storm where the water rains, water rises slowly, reaches a peak that is not as high, and then as a watershed gets paved, you have flow rises more quickly, is a lot more flashy, and higher flows tend to erode creeks, erode channels, and destroy habitat, trees along the creek banks and things like that, and increase the chances of flooding. So a lot of what we do is modifying this built environment to reduce the runoff and by capturing and infiltrating stormwater on site. And doing this increases the groundwater recharge and creek base flows in between rainstorms. So you have more groundwater flowing to the creek, and that sustains a more stable creek flow. Protects water quality by filtering those pollutants, reduces that peak runoff, and reduces those erosional forces and that destroy riparian areas and cause downcutting in the creeks. And that brings us to parkways. And a parkway, what we're talking about about parkways today is it's that space in between the street and private properties that is not the sidewalk. That is public property. It's in the right-of-way. And parkways often contain utilities, storm drains, water meters, sewer pipes, street trees, signs, and they're crisscrossed by driveways. They are most often maintained by the property owner that is right behind each piece of right-of-way. So they're responsible for maintaining the vegetation. And they vary in ground cover. They're often natural, sometimes they're landscaped, and very often there's hardscape on these parkways too. So these represent an opportunity to capture some of that rainwater and incidental urban flow that is coming off of the public right-of-way, off of the streets and sidewalks. And many cities in the country have programs that utilize these parkways. They've had them for decades. And the city has done a lot of these too. Creeks Division has built several of these. The city of Santa Barbara, Public Works has built a lot of these as part of larger projects and private projects, but we don't really have, we haven't really had a program-wide in place. And so that's what we're looking to do. You know, the nature of this whole thing has been a bit piecemeal in putting these in place, but we're looking to develop a program to implement these more widely. These are a couple aerial views. The one on the left is a portion of downtown. The one on the right, I think, is the east side. And it's an illustration of the aerial view of the surfaces in the city. You can see there's a lot of roofs, a lot of parking lots, and the right-of-way represents a lot of impervious area in the city. And as the city becomes more and more built out, it becomes more and more important to utilize the spaces that we have available to use for stormwater capture. And the gray is the streets, obviously, and then the white surrounding that is concrete. And then you can kind of see some parkways. I think these are summer pictures, so it's a little bit brown. Here are some examples of street views of parkways and sort of the different variations of them. They come in all different shapes and sizes. The top left picture has grass on the left. So ideally, stormwater or rain, when it rains, it will go from the sidewalk and flow towards the street and pass through that parkway and be captured. All sidewalks are generally graded to flow that way, towards the street. That one's a little bit mounded, so what often happens is when we get a decent amount of rain, it ends up flowing around it off the ramp and into the street. On the right side of it, you can see that there is pavement. It's been paved in, and there are just tree wells right there. And that's common in more like State Street and a lot of the downtown areas that need more pedestrian spaces. On the top right picture, we've got variations in size. On the left, you've got a 9-foot wide parkway. On the right, it's about a 3 or 4 foot parkway. And so the opportunities to retrofit those parkways will be different, and it'll depend on different things like that. And so on the left, you see more pavement in the parkway, the bottom left picture, and on the left of it, there's some concrete. On the right, there's brick that's been filled in. In fact, the parkways, it's required to have a permit to actually put pavement in the parkways. It happens often, people see a need, and I totally understand that. Sometimes places get walked on, but technically they should get a permit. And so, and then the last one, the picture on the bottom right, we've got a standard size small parkway on the right, and on the left, there's actually city right-of-way in that picture, I'm pretty sure. And this occurs in a lot of areas in the city where it looks like private property, but it's actually public right-of-way. There just isn't a sidewalk there. And some neighborhoods have a lot of that. Some parts of the Mesa and San Roque have a lot of that, and that's fine, but it's just an illustration of all of the different public rights-of-way. So, just looking citywide, we did just a analysis of the impact that this could have, and there are roughly 27,000 parcels in the city, and a typical lot has about 50 feet of frontage, so 50 feet wide at the sidewalk, and a standard sidewalk is 5 feet wide. So 250 square feet per house, say, typically are average, right? And so when you multiply that by 27,000, you end up with about 155 acres of sidewalk. And if we were just able to capture that sidewalk runoff, prevent that from flowing directly to the street, which is a pretty simple thing to do. If we're able to capture that runoff and allow it to go into parkways, it's a pretty big impact. 150, we wouldn't be able to find a 155 acre site. And so, and the benefit is that this is all done in the place where it is. And so, and maybe we might be able to do more, but go ahead. So we had a resident approach us who was very interested in putting in a parkway project where it captured stormwater runoff from the street, so she'd be able to use that water. She was interested in the water quality benefits. She came from Washington, D.C., who has a big program, and so she knew a lot about this, and she wanted to do this at her property. And so this ended up being a perfect timing for a pilot project for this site. And her property is the one, you can see the mouse, it's the one on the right. It's a 9-foot wide parkway. And it's a little spot, but it's a really good area to be able to capture street runoff. This is the bottom, the left picture shows it from across the street, and then the right picture shows shows that parkway strip. And then the next slide, you can see after a rain, this is a site where it's sort of mounded, and a lot of the runoff from the sidewalk ends up just traveling down and going out down the next driveway out to the street. So what we're looking at for this project is doing a couple of curb cuts. And as you look down this, we're looking downstream, the gutter's on the right, the property's on the left, so you can see the sidewalk. And we would have a curb cut sort of right after the driveway is really here in the foreground, right there where the mouse is. We'd have a curb cut, and water would be able to flow into there, and there would be a depression and allow that water to soak into the ground. And here's a little thumbnail sketch of it. So you just kind of, water is able to pool up. Once it fills up, it's able to passively just exit, and this will really stop flowing in. Because of the trees in the middle, which is common and great, we want to work around that. So we'll put in 2 curb cuts. We'll put in 1 down below. And so fortunately in this site, we have enough room. And so after this, we did a survey and developed a little more specific plans. We worked with the property owner to develop this, Public Works Engineering, Transportation, and Forestry, and they provided great input and design considerations because, there's a lot to consider. There's a lot of infrastructure, there's protecting the curb and gutter and the street, and protecting the street trees, and then also considering pedestrians and people who are getting in and out of their cars. And so to build around all that, so there's a lot of things that go into it. This is kind of a more developed design of it, and with the survey points that we had. And you can see on the left is the upstream, the top is the sidewalk, on the bottom is the street. And you can just see where the water goes into that depression, and then on the downstream end where it goes into that depression. You can see a couple constraints, the street tree and a water meter. Oh, and these are, what follows is a few cross sections. So we're kind of looking upstream. This is if you cut that thing in half. On the right side is the sidewalk. On the left side is the curb and gutter. And it's interesting how high the sidewalk is compared to the gutter. It's over a foot in difference. And so that goes into how we design this. We want to leave a little ledge next to the sidewalk so that if a stroller wheel falls off or your foot happens to walk off of it, you don't fall into a steep hole. And then we wanted to keep that slope to a gentle slope, as gentle a slope as possible, but also meet that bottom end to where we can actually store a significant amount of water. This is the cross-section where the tree is, root protection there. We will be putting a layer of mulch on top of the soil to protect that, and then you can go to the next slide. The next view, this is where the water meter is. We want to be conservative on all of these. We don't want to break meters, and we want to make sure this works. And I think this is the second to last one, but this is towards the end. This is the second curb cut at the bottom. And you can see, so it's quite a bit of water storage potential. Now, we're not going to be capturing all the water from all of Gutierrez Street, but you could see if this was implemented at every house, we could capture a significant amount. And so, it's that low-impact development approach. So this is sort of on the high end of what these projects would look like. The cost for this includes excavation, soil removal, cobble installation, and hand and finishing the grade, and then the curb cuts. And the cost is going to be $6,400. We got costs from several contractors. And we plan to install this in mid-July 2025. And actually the contractor who's going to be working on it is Wilson Environmental. And interestingly, Daniel Wilson helped design Elmer Avenue, a big project that was in Los Angeles years ago that's well known for kind of capturing street runoff. The resident is interested in planting it, and we will monitor this for functionality and make sure the infrastructure isn't being affected by any water infiltrating, and then the resident will maintain the plantings. So moving forward, we've done a sort of a citywide analysis, an initial citywide analysis, and we would like to reach out to property owners. We want to work with property owners who are interested in this, and hopefully our outreach garners some people contacting us who are interested in this in this thing, and we'll, like I said, it's been piecemeal as it is, but hopefully we can kind of get more and more opportunities, and so we'll evaluate those opportunities, create designs, different designs, and maybe create some design templates. Every site is different, but we'd like to kind of have some design templates that will streamline this process and make it relatively inexpensive to go in and do these. You can do the next slide. This is a graphic output of one of the analysis that we did, and this is all the lines represent the right-of-way areas in the city. And we had a lot of inputs, but basically the color is green. It represents lower slope. So, dark green is almost flat. And then as it goes to yellow and orange and red is really steep. And the width of, it's hard to see zooming out except for the really extreme areas, but the width is how wide that actual parkway is. So there's a lot of parkways available that are pretty wide, that are not heavily sloped. But, and then, there are some outliers here. You can see like up in San Roque, I think that data is skewed because we don't have a sidewalk and street tree data necessarily right there. So we didn't have those data inputs, but there are opportunities up there and on the mesa too. And, but even if we have a steep slope or narrow, we think there's probably a design that could be implemented. You can go to the next slide. And we'll, basically, like I was saying, we'll have sort of a scale of different designs. And the most basic design, like I talked about, sort of capturing that 155 acres of impervious surface runoff, that would be where we amend the soil in the parkway and grade it to accept that sidewalk runoff. A lot of times, even in parkways, the soil has been heavily compacted, and water even goes to that, and it just runs right off anyway, or it doesn't really soak in very well. The next step up would be where we have pavement and a property owner is interested in removing that. We've had a couple instances of that where they're interested, and we'd remove the pavement from the parkway and then grade it to accept the sidewalk runoff. The highest tier, essentially, or the highest kind of grade of these things would be to accept that street runoff, and that happens to be what we're doing in this pilot project. And that's cutting curbs and grading it a lot lower to accept the runoff. So that would be the most expensive, but hopefully we can, the goal of this project is to implement this as widely as possible, keep costs down, and keep it as simple as possible and accept that passive runoff. There may be other opportunities in public right-of-way spaces like medians, other public spaces that aren't necessarily being used for other things that we might be able to utilize those for stormwater capture too. Yeah, so the next step, our standard outreach protocol, newsletters and our social media posts, city TVs and outreach events. Hopefully that garners some support and actually, at the project that we're doing right now, I think a couple of neighbors are interested in too. So as we develop these, we might be able to, maybe we have some signage or maybe we have some kind of little thing explaining what it is, and inevitably people see that and they become interested in implementing that. So that concludes the presentation. I'll take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. This is very exciting. I've long been a big fan of curb cutouts and the potential for increasing stormwater runoff capture and infiltration. But we're first, this is an item for discussion, so we'll go first to questions from the committee, and then we do have one public comment, and then we'll come back to the committee for discussion. Committee member Lee.
How do I sign up?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll put you on the list. I actually put my email address and phone number on this last slide. I will contact you. But for anyone in the public who's interested, you can email me. You can also email the Creeks Division. It'll get to me somehow. But yeah, great.
Awesome. We are adding to the list right now. Questions on this end here from the committee?
There we go again. Such a great program. I'm really excited about it. And I'm kind of thinking of the cost and the, what was it, 20, how many? did you say 27,000 parcels? So I was just wondering about budgeting. I was also wondering, like, that's a lot of plans to come up with, even if you have a kind of some stock plans. And I know for a lot of drainage, people bring their plans to the city and they have it done. What are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Chair Owens and Committee Member Moret, yeah, it's a good question. Yes, this could be, if this all came at once, it really wouldn't be feasible to do. But it's, we don't really know what the interest will be and how fast this will go. And so we can, as the need arises, we can scale up. There will be a limit to that, of course. But, we would like to develop some standard template designs. Public Works has some developed, and that's we use some of these, this design kind of drawing from that, but a little more, maybe a variety of them that we can really fit into a lot of different projects, and then maybe adjust it a little bit where a tree is or a utility is, to make it a little more streamlined so it's quick and low cost.
And I believe we have a question from Committee Member Todd.
Yeah, Tim, I just wanted to say this is awesome. I spent a lifetime in technology with entrepreneurs, and their characteristic was to look for holes in issues or problems, have a vision, and try and resolve them. And they sometimes were big outcomes, but they started with a simple first step. And you just defined that in your presentation. I'm really, really impressed with that, and I think that while there is budget and operations and issues yet to come, I think you're a pioneer in forming an entrepreneurial formula here that could really be helpful. And I just wanted to congratulate you.
Chair Owens, Committee Member Rulon Miller, I appreciate that. Yeah, and this has been a team effort, so thank you.
All right, we'll go to public comment. Chris, if you'd like to come up, please.
Chris Dahlstrom, 424 North Ontario Road. This is a good example of really well-used resources, both staff and time, effort, and money. I would sign up. However, we capture all of our water onto our property, so nothing runs to the street. And this would, if you're thinking out of the box, which obviously Mr. Burgess is thinking out of the box, applies this to the city streets and impervious areas of the city that the city owns. And if you did a flow rating of street and sidewalk runoff, which those are impervious surfaces, you would find that a significant amount of water runoff comes from the watershed itself when the urban area line happens. It's from city streets. Again, it's contributed, of course, by roofs and driveways, but those areas that are acreage and square footage that are city streets, if there's a way to capture that runoff into these types of retention basins or some other method, that is a heck of a good resource to utilize the staff in doing that. I just wanted to say thank you for that. It gives me some encouragement. I used to work for the city in Public Works, worked for the county, and also worked for a water district for 25 years. So you have to think beyond, and this is a good example of thinking beyond, but also having and utilizing your analytical and your data correctly. So I'm not going to go backwards, but going forward, that is, this was a very good presentation, and it's something I think the public could get behind. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now it's back to the committee, and if there's further discussion from the committee. I think we're all big fans and really look forward to seeing how this project moves forward and the successes. And I just wish I had a city curb. I could do some curb cuts and some stormwater capture myself, but I look forward to checking out the projects as they move forward. So that concludes our business items for this evening, and it is,
Chair Owen, I just want to say thank you, Tim, for such a great presentation. Also, iterate that, I think there was a question about budget. So we do have 50,000 allocated going forward in our fiscal year. We can always look at adjusting that up if we end up having a waiting list of projects because there is so much public interest. We'll be thrilled, and we can always relook at that. This program so well ties into the stormwater rebate program we recently launched, and so it's just another opportunity to just engage with the community about stormwater, have them really understand and be better educated about that, but then, maybe even opportunities where people partake in both programs and are able to do some stormwater rebate retrofits on their private property, as well as, if they're really interested in the parkway. So just wanted to say that.
That gave me another question.
Another
if I
plug
may.
for our rebate program. if I can
Right,
get it
so
out there.
that stormwater implementation program is a rebate-based program. Is this project, I know you're doing a few pilots and there's funding for that, but do you anticipate that there will maybe be some sort of rebate for the public who might want to implement projects like this on their property?
Chair Owen, that's a great question. So at this point, we're launching the pilot, and we'll obviously reassess and go from there if the cost of these gets astronomical. But given this is in the public right-of-way, we are looking at creeks just funding these efforts for the Parkway program. The rebate program on private property is set up differently as far as how we're funding that. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification. That's really exciting. All right, with that, it is 6:46, and I am happy to adjourn this meeting. Thanks, everyone.